Welcome back to ManaTutor MTG Draft. We're day one into Pioneer Masters, and today we'll be taking a look at the initial data. In particular, what decks you might want to consider playing and what decks to avoid. So without further ado, let's dive in. So here we have the win rates according to all 10 overall archetypes for each of the two-color archetypes. We have a 57.6% win rate for Boros in first, followed by 56.1% for Dimir Control, and then we have white-green with 55.6, red-green with 55.3, blue-white flyers with 54.3, and then black-red mid-range for 54.1. At that point, we get a little bit of a jump to the lower decks, the lower tier decks at that point, with Izzet at 52.7, black-green at 51.1, blue-green at 49.7, and white-black aristocrats at 49.4. You'll see kind of we have a lot of different kinds of decks up on the top. So we have the Boros Aggro #1 and Dimir Control, kind of two ends of the spectrum in the top two. You kind of your mid-range decks are the ones that are not performing quite as well, or those that are dirtling around with aristocrats and that kind of stuff. I don't know, Matt. What's your take on the first day's data for this format?
Right. I mean, it's obviously very early, right? And aggro always tends to perform fairly well early. So I'm not surprised to see Boros at the top, just having seen some of like the pre-release streams and things like that, and people doing really, really, really well with the heroic mechanic, because really heroic is the one mechanic that I think has some consistency in this set. All of that and gates, right? The gates is sort of the other only set consistent mechanic. So it's not surprising that Boros is performing well, I think. I'm surprised about some of the others, right? Because I do think the strengths of certain colors can tend to, factor into how well an archetype can do. I think a lot of this is going to change fairly dramatically over the coming week, even few days, but to 1 week, right? As people really figure out where the strengths are in each set. I'll note, for example, like if you look at 17 Lands card data right now, the number one card is Ob Nixilis's Cruelty, right, with a 60.8% win rate or something like that. But black overall is not necessarily performing well. And so I think it's probably its weakest performing color right now. I think we're going to go over that in a second. It's interesting, right? I think it's just very early. People are trying to figure out the set. I do think, and we can get into this a little bit, but like the two color archetypes are not necessarily even as relevant as they would be in most sets. So
yeah, I agree with your take that people are figuring it out. There's a lot to figure out in this set, right? More cards than we're used to by quite a bit, and of mechanics that are all over the place throughout the history of the past more than a decade of Magic. So there's a lot of weird things you face and interact with, and so we're trying to kind of figure out where that settles. Aggro with Boros and the named heroic mechanic
right.
is the most straightforward. It is by far the most drafted. In fact, it's doubly drafted on 17 lands compared to the next highest archetype, which I don't remember which one that was. I think it might be Dimir next, but double the amount. That means that good players are forcing that right now, and I think it is forcible for the foreseeable future until people are starting to catch on to the data and realize that, and then it becomes overdrafted and that win rate starts moving to the others. But I wonder how quickly that'll happen. Usually it takes about 2 weeks before the meta shifts. And in 2 weeks, we have a new bonus sheet of spells that has a lot of heroic type spells on there. So it'll be interesting to see if spells bonus sheet overcomes the meta differential that we'll see, or if that's not enough just being a bonus sheet to really overwork the spreading out of drafting the different colors.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you're absolutely right there. And in terms of like the mechanics being all over the place, I mean, I'll give an example from one of my own games, right, where I thought something would work and it didn't, right? So the card Gore Clan Rampager, the 4/4 for 4 with trample, and you can use Blood Rush to pay a red and a green to discard it and give +4/+4 and trample to a creature, does not trigger heroic, which I did not like. I guess if I had thought about it a little bit more, I would have realized that. But I cast it on a heroic card, and I was like, wait a minute, why is heroic not triggering? But it's not a spell at that point. It's an ability on the creature card. that allows you to discard it. So you're not casting it. On the plus side, it means it's not counterable. On the downside, it means it also doesn't trigger heroic. So interesting, like it's mechanics like that we either haven't seen in a long time or haven't seen in combination with these types of other mechanics that we're seeing, that I think it's people need to figure it out, right? Even seasoned Magic players are going to make those kind of mistakes. Like, I mean, I should have read the card a little bit closer. It didn't cost me the game, but it was one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, now I know how that works.
Like we said, there's a lot of cards and a lot of mechanics, so it's easy to get tripped up on things like that. Also, I think we mentioned in our initial episode on this about how we haven't played with Bestow before ourselves.
Right.
And that is an interesting one. It is particularly good in the aggro decks that then have a little bit more mid-game reach. So basically the white-green, red-green type decks, I think that's why they're performing so well here. They're still aggro to get under the control decks and just have the Bestow top end with some triggers. Like one of the best green commons right now is the 4-mana 4/4 trample, that when it's a target of a spell or ability, draw a card, right? So you get your draw engine going with that, bestowing onto that or targeting that. And yeah, I think that plays a lot into the winningness of green in particular and Naya in general. But the other deck that you're sure to run across is Gates, which you alluded to, Matt. And maybe we can go over the how we see that playing out in the numbers.
Because this is the most interesting data to me. Granted, it's a day and a half's worth of data at this point. It's not definitive. These numbers will shift probably dramatically over time. But it's still fascinating to look at. Yeah, so this is a basic chart looking at the number of colors played in the deck and then the win rate for that number of colors in that deck, right? So if you look at all the decks that are monocolored, having a average win rate of 51.5%, all the decks that are two colored, 54.5. Then we actually drop down a bit with three colors to 51.4, which is the least winning deck by just a hair there. And then when you go to 4 and 5, they go up, right? So you've got your 4-color archetypes and then your domain archetype basically sitting at the highest win rate right now of everything, right? So it's really interesting to see like the stats look like that, because I don't think we've seen that maybe ever, or maybe not since the last time Gates were printed. Yeah, that just plays into this whole, everybody's figuring out this set, and the people who have figured out the Gates decks and how those work are doing amazing, right? And we'll probably continue to do amazing for a while.
Yeah, the volume is much lower of the
Right.
4 and 5
Yes.
than the colors that are less, right? So it is a select few people that are doing a lot of winning by drafting the Gates decks right now. And I do think that'll kind of shift a little bit as well as people realize, oh, I can get into the Gates deck myself and start stealing that a little bit. I guess the key there is there's a gate in every pack. So there's so many available that if you carve out your lane of taking the gates, there's also just a lot of powerful cards and random colors that you can gain access to once you start taking the gates fairly early. I did draft a gates deck, and it became basically, I have access to any color of mana. I'm not going to worry about colors. I'll take the best card in every pack moving forward. And like we said before, I mean, this is obvious, but good cards win, right? So if I can play every good card that I've drafted, as long as an aggro deck doesn't beat me to be able to play those good cards, I'm going to win. And that's what this format really seems to be shaping up as. The aggro decks that can get under gates and gates.
At least, again, first 2 days. Well, that's going to change. People will figure out unique strategies. I think people, I would not be surprised to see and it already is, right? Dimir control is number 2. I would not be surprised to see Azorius control move up there, as people start finding ways to kind of counter the Gates strategy. And it's like, I'm just going to play heavy counter spells and removal and bouncing and use that to counter gates. Like I think the archetypes will shift over time. First few days though, gates are enjoying like a pretty strong success rate.
Moving on to color rankings, we've reorganized our colors. Black is not the first, it's in last. So we are alluding to, we were a little bit wrong on our predictions there. Red and white seem to be the top two, pretty equal there. They go in, the color pairs are working well with three other colors for each one of those colors, whereas blue, green, and black each pair with only two other colors well in those archetype rankings. And so we have red and white beating blue, which seems to be winning enough at a clip that it's slightly better than green, but green and black are roughly equal at the bottom.
I mean, and it is interesting though, like to see, Demir is currently the second best of the two colored archetypes, right? But if you look at the color rankings, they're all kind of in, third through tied for fifth place. It's interesting still.
So I played a Demir control deck, and it was my actually best deck that I played. And I liked it, especially with the Mystic, the 1/5 creature that whenever you cast instant or sorcery spell makes a 1/1 flyer. It felt a lot like Gremlin Tamer and playing out enchantments, but every time you play an instant or sorcery, which is more than that than there were enchantments, you end up getting 1/1 flyer. Now, that's a 4-mana creature rather than a 2-mana creature, right? So that changes the speed at which you can do things. You're creating 1/1s and slowly kind of building up a board to control over time while your spells limit your opponent's ability to do anything. But it does play out well. I still, when I lost, that deck went 5-3, and I lost to Gates decks, right? Like they still overvalued me. So I like Gates currently, at least, more than I like blue-black control, but it is the other viable control deck that can overcome the aggro decks. In terms of takeaways, I think the tier 1 deck right now is Naya aggro, specifically the red-white is the best of that. I think you do want to start in red or white as the two most open colors. And I do think you can soft force Boros. What I mean by soft force is take Boros cards when they're the best cards in the pack until you clearly see another color that is a signal that's a better card than a Boros card. So in this, you will land in Boros unless told otherwise. That's how I define soft forcing. I don't think you can just straight up force it. I don't think it's that open.
Yeah, and it's only going to get less open.
Yeah, rely on the heroic and bestow for the mid game value in those decks. Also for the rest of the Naya colors, and red green can do that as well. And green white, as we saw in the win rates, that plays well in the same fashion. Tier 2, I would even consider possibly tier 1 if you're open enough on it, is Gates. Definitely a good deck to go into. If you haven't played 5-color Gates before, it's a good learning deck. You may stumble and not play it right your first time or first several times, but it's a good way to learn how to play 5 colors. And then blue-black control is in that tier as well, just below Gates, I think. These decks really do outvalue mid-range, and that's where I think a lot of our predictions went wrong before day one. A lot of the black cards that help towards mid-range, for example, are not as good as I thought they would be. And then tier 3, blue-white flyers seems better than I thought it would be, and black-red value is, reasonable. Those do act a little bit more mid-rangey and are reasonable decks. But tier 4 is the 4 decks I'm basically looking to avoid right now. There's probably other versions of these decks that are viable, and I do think the stats will change over time, but blue-red, black-green, blue-green, and especially white-black have not been a fan. I tried a white-black deck, and it did not go well.
It's okay. I did a Boros deck, and it did not go well. So, I mean, sometimes they just, played a 16 land deck, 15 lands plus a double-sided, and flooded 2 of my 3 losses. So it happens.
So as we mentioned, unlike Bloomburrow, Duskmourn, and Foundations, we were wrong in our predictions for Pioneer Masters. We mentioned we had less confidence in the set going in with the amount of cards that there were and all the different mechanics and the lack of exposure to bestow. But I do think we correctly nailed red and green as pretty strong in terms of how it can play aggressively. We kind of pinned the Jund colors, including red, green, and black, as what we wanted to do going into this set. And I think I would just remove black from that and replace it with white. And
Right.
then the same holds.
Yeah, I think largely, but again, it's hard to know, you know, like at all going into a set, and I think even in this set we were even less confident, right? I wouldn't say we're confident in any set when we rate, because it's all subjective, right? You can look at a card, Jeremy, and say you love the card. I can look at a card and be like, I hate the card. I never want to play that card. And one of us will be right and one of us will be wrong. It is what it is. But it's an interesting set, and I'm looking forward to playing a lot of it.